I'm not a fan of how we do tipping at restaurants. Not a fan. Not a fan of it. Now, if anybody has seen the movie Reservoir Dogs, there's an amazing, brilliant scene that's written by Quentin Tarantino that perfectly outlines the debate of this whole thing. So you probably should just tune off this podcast and go watch that scene instead, because they do a much better job of debating tipping in that scene. But if you're still here, Steve Buscemi's character perfectly outlines exactly how I feel about tipping, which is I'm not against tipping. If someone does a good job, you should be able to tip them. But what I don't like is this societal pressure that you have to tip 20%. And when I say have to, it doesn't mean like I'm required to by law. It means if I don't, I'm perceived as a jerk or an a-hole. And I'm like, why is it that that applies here, but not over here? You don't tip people at McDonald's. You don't tip people in regular customer service jobs like the grocery store. They serve you food. And I'm not against people receiving tips. If you want to tip somebody, go for it. Do it. But if I don't do it, you can't call me a jerk. I'm sorry. I don't understand this whatsoever. And the first thing out of everybody's mouth when I say this is, those people need tips, to make their payments. Like it's usually people in, school that are trying to, just get by. It's, like a very minimum wage job. I'm like, I understand all that. I've worked minimum wage jobs, never got a tip. And I didn't care. It was like, hey, listen, it'd be great if I got tips, but I didn't get them, and I survived just fine. And you don't have to force anybody to do that. And if someone doesn't tip me, I don't call them a jerk. So that's my unpopular opinion.
Joel, you might know this, but I think I might have an argument against your opinion, Dillon. And I actually kind of agree with you because, like, tipping is like a very American thing. Like,
yes.
Other parts of the world, people don't tip. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason why it's such a big thing is because in the restaurant industry, like wait staff doesn't even get minimum wage. Like they get less than minimum wage. And it's legal because of tipping. Like it's like tipping is like part of their wage, and it's like factored in. So like as a waiter, you like don't even get minimum wage in some jobs. I don't know. You were a waiter, Joel.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things said. Gotta clear up some things.
Joel's been a waiter in this case.
Yes. All right. So as far as the wage, so waiters do get paid minimum wage. It's like a state law.
F you, Joel. Prove me wrong.
However,
it's on Hulu, Luke.
It's on Hulu, Luke. You just have to pay $60 a month. But you also, by law, have to declare your tips. Mm-hmm. And taxes, they're taxed, your tips. So because we live in America, when you get tipped, you automatically, once you declare that, you get paid less than minimum wage. So like, for example, my paychecks were like, if I worked 2 weeks, I would get paid like $150. Like that would be my paycheck, which is like nothing. So like all my money came from tips, basically. That's where that argument comes from. Dillon, I'm trying to remember some of your arguments. Just because you're saying like just because they're serving food doesn't mean they should get tipped. Correct. I don't think you should tip like the McDonald's person at the window, but they're not doing as much as a waiter does. So waiter is like literally waiting on you, right? So they're not just waiting on you, they're waiting on 7 other tables or whatever is happening. Working a lot harder, a lot faster. And there's a lot of details that go into that for each table. But as far as like, should we tip, should we not tip, whatever, I totally agree with you that if you have a terrible waiter, 20%, no, out the window. I'm a waiter, or I was a waiter, and I'm not going to tip 20% for a crappy service. It's not going to happen. And that's what in my opinion, makes tipping fair, is that you have the power as the customer to tip however much you want. Now, on the flip side of that is when you are a waiter, sometimes you provide really good service and you don't get tipped at all. And that means basically you get nothing for like that table, and you spent 2 hours with that whole family trying to serve them, giving everything they want, and you get nothing. Because again, you're declaring all your other tips, that's deducted from your paycheck, and you don't get anything from that table, it's like awesome. So I just wasted 2 hours of my day. So there's like a lot to be said about all that kind of stuff, but I don't agree that like it should be an automatic 20% no matter what. And I don't necessarily agree that there's a pressure to do that. I think there's a pressure to tip, but 20% for each server, bad or good, I don't think that exists or shouldn't exist anyway.
Yeah, and I think like the discrepancy somewhere, and again, I need to make this abundantly clear to anybody else who is going to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm for tipping. Tip your helpers if you want to. But I think like the discrepancy is when you do it and when you shouldn't do it. Because there's a lot of services out there. And I think the part where maybe like we would disagree on is the difficulty of the job itself and when is it required, because that's a huge gray area. Like we probably will never agree on when a particular service is required to receive a tip and not. But it almost seems like it's a prerequisite when you go to a restaurant, you are going to tip the waitress no matter what. But that's not a prerequisite for a lot of other positions and other industries that I personally feel require just as much work, and they're getting paid minimum wage without any tips. Now, a lot of people would disagree with me on that.
Give me one example of that.
Like you would, an auto mechanic or I would feel like people that work in fast food industries are working probably just as hard as they would. It probably requires a different skill level, but I feel like the difficulty level is just the same.
I don't think an auto mechanic is getting paid minimum wage.
Well, as far they're doing a personal service for you. It's like,
sure, but they're not getting paid minimum wage, is what I'm saying.
All right, so
or less than minimum wage.
And this is like the thing is that when we say restaurant workers, take for example, we're just talking about waiters because that's like the most prime example. People always say, well, that's what they get paid because that's where they get paid in tips because that's where they make most of the money because that's what the restaurant can afford. Is it not possible to just put all that money back into the cost of the food? That way we don't have to pay for tips, and that way we don't have to have this whole like conversation about when it's acceptable, when it's not acceptable.
Yeah, and some of, especially in Seattle, and I know other cities are doing it too, where it's an automatic gratuity already added to the check. But people get upset about that because it's like, well, what if you get bad service? That's like exactly what you're saying. It's like, well, now I'm automatically paying this person 20% when they didn't do a good job. But then that's exactly what you're saying to do, Dillon, is like, well, why don't you just put it in the bill and like we don't have to worry about tipping? It's like, well, when you do that, people complain anyway. So it's like,
well, what you can do is just put it not into a gratuity and just put it into the cost of the food. The burger doesn't cost $10; it costs $12. So it's like, all right, like that factors into the cost. Like I don't just make the burger; I have to serve it to you as well.
You can do that, but that's literally just hiding it, trying to hide it from the customer. But is anybody going to go to a restaurant and pay $20 for a $15 burger?
Well, I don't think it would be that much of an increase. But this is like the gray area, right? Is that now we're talking about like specific examples. But as far as like the pressure to tip anybody as a requirement, I feel like has been like, I don't think I've ever spent a time at a restaurant where it said, all right, how much are we supposed to tip here? And like that's never been a non-conversation. It always is like, you have to tip. And I'm like, well, what if I want to tip only $2 because that's all I got on me? And then everyone's like, well, hold on, we have to do 15-20%. And that's where I go, all right, hold on. Again, I'm for tipping. I think people should receive tips, if they want to tip. And I just think it gets totally blown out of proportion a lot of times because people are like, it has to be 15-20%. But I think there's a huge swath of a gray area here that starts to drive me nuts because there's no consistency to it. And it's like, all right, what are we supposed to do about
I'll just say you should go into, if you're going to a restaurant, you should be preparing to pay 20%. If they don't meet that standard, like if they're not good, and if you're just sitting there without like a server for like 30 minutes and nobody's like even taking your order, then you can reduce that, no problem.
So what if I say you did a bad job, no tip, and they said I did a great job? Then what?
That's not up to them. It's up to you.
Well, and I think that's the thing is that it's somehow become a thing where everyone goes, no, he did a good job, you're just an a-hole. And I'm like, no, I think you didn't do a good job.
No, this is, I mean, what you're talking about is basically capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. This is, if you do a good job, then you're going to get paid for doing a good job. If you didn't, then you're not going to get paid for doing a good job.
Mm-hmm. Well, right. I mean, but that's the whole point about why I brought this up in the first place is that that pressure you get from everybody saying you have to tip 20% when I can easily say I disagree, they go, well, you're just an a-hole. I'm like, no, I'm not an a-hole. I just disagree with you.
I don't know
Who's
of
calling
any
you an
person.
a-hole, Dylan? I think we
I
need to
know.
contact
I don't
that
know of
person.
any person who's calling you an a-hole. If you
Nope.
get bad service and you don't tip them or tip them like 20%, they're not going to be like, what's wrong with you? Like, of course, like I know, at least all the servers I know and me personally, like I'm not going to tip. There's not going to be a chance in hell that I'm going to tip every server 20% because not all of them are going to meet that standard.
So if I tipped every waiter 5% from here on out, you guys wouldn't call me out on that.
I would say if they deserved more, then you should have paid them more.
See, this is like the discrepancy here is that I could say, why isn't it 2%? Why isn't it 50%? You know, like it could be any amount. Somehow we've arbitrarily said 20%. But if I disagree, it's somehow, well, they deserve more. I'm like, well, we just disagree. And you go, well, you're not being fair enough. And I'm like, well, see, this is the argument. Like, I don't think I'm being a jerk. I just think they only deserve this much.
Then I encourage you to take up a waiting job and see if that 20% meets what you feel you deserve. And if you're like, actually, I'm getting paid way more than I think I should be paid, then you can make the argument that you're making. Working in the service industry, I don't think 20% is too much to ask for good service.
Yeah,
I think another thing complicates this, Dylan. I think a lot of times, if you go out to a restaurant, say the four of us go out to a restaurant together, and we're splitting the bill, and at the end of the meal, we split the bill, and we say, okay, me and Joel, we're gonna put in $5 each to tip the waiter. And Dylan puts in 50 cents. Like I think that's the discrepancy. And like, it's not so much, I mean, it could be your viewpoint of like, maybe you didn't like the waiter. Maybe you don't think that they should get as much, but I think I think in that scenario, it's less about like the percentage of tipping the person, more of the social norm of like contributing to the meal equally. You know what I mean? Like I think that more so than like the actual like theory of tipping or like the amount or the percentage. I think it's like, okay, what is like socially, if I'm with my friends or family and I'm splitting the check or like we're all piling in for the tip, it's like, I think that is gonna cause more butting heads than if you got the bill and you're like, I got this, guys. No one would give a like you could leave him a penny and we would all just happily walk away and like, okay, whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's if there's a pool of people in, and that's where the differing opinions come into play.
Yeah. This is almost like directly from that scene in Reservoir Dogs, where it was just one person versus like this whole table going like, I don't believe in that, type of thing. But I think you're exactly right. Like that's where like a lot of the conflict comes into play. Is that if you're at the restaurant by yourself, you're a significant other, and you're the only one to see the bill, this is probably not that big of a deal. But it becomes a much bigger issue if you're in a group setting. Because like, what if you're the person that says, I don't feel like pitching in an extra $5 because that person didn't meet my standards for service. And I think that's where things get a little more complicated. But that's where a lot of my frustration comes from, is because I'm like, what if I just disagree and I don't want to put in that much? Therefore, now I'm the jerk. And that logic just drives me crazy because, and to Joel's the argument about like you should work a service job, yeah, that's the same argument I hear every time I bring this up. And I'm like, listen, I've never worked as a waiter. And I'm sure this is where a lot of people tune out and they go, oh, you can't talk. I'm like, well, what? Are you saying that a waiter is like the hardest minimum wage job there is? Like, I don't think so. I think there is plenty of minimum wage jobs out there that are just as difficult that you don't get tips for. Like, I've worked 2 minimum wage jobs in my life that were customer service, just BS jobs that you hate. Didn't get any tips for them, but I wasn't sitting around going, well, I don't want to get any tips. Like, and it's just the inconsistency of it that drives me crazy. But I think, Luke, your point about when you're in a group setting, it becomes that's where this situation arises, is because now the fairness of what everybody else is putting in is now directly involved. And you're like, all right, I don't know how to negotiate with that and not be a jerk. And I mean, most of the time I don't skim over tipping. Like, I can't remember the last time I didn't give like 15, 20% on a tip. But I just don't like the idea that if I were to go down on that, I'm somehow this a-hole who just doesn't appreciate good service or something like that. And I'm like, what? Like, I feel like I could just go down a little bit more, and yeah, it's just that stuff bugs me.
From now on, I'm going to take a photo of all of your receipts, Dylan, at every restaurant, and I'm going to keep them in a record. They're going to come back to haunt you.
You know, and probably a lot of people won't believe me, but I swear it's true. I don't remember the last time I didn't tip 15 or 20%. And it's just because that's just like this social norm. That's the thing that people do. But that's the thing that bugs me, is that it is a social norm that has little to no consistency or logic to it with other industries. So, again, just my opinion.
Yeah, we can agree to disagree, but I can remember when I tipped less than 15% because the service was terrible. I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to reward horrible service.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like, that just doesn't make any sense.
I know that Cody tips pretty liberally, actually. He puts in a lot. Every time we go out, because Cody's like very conservative with his money. You know, not to out him here on this podcast, but
son of a you damn Nazi.
Again.
Every time.
But every time we go out, Cody's like 30%. You know, like just going way over the top, 30%. And I'm like, whoa, hold on. Like, slow down.
30%.
Yeah. But you're usually very attentive to that.
Yeah. Because I put myself in their shoes. Like, that's what you look forward to when you're working in that industry. Mm-hmm. Like, you get that job because you want to get good tips. So that's why I get that job. Mm-hmm. But it makes me feel good when I tip because I know that's why they're there. If they do a good job, I'm like, sure, yeah, 20%. Mm-hmm. If they do an average job, it's 15. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to prove my point further, there were servers where I worked that got more tips than other servers because they were better. Mm-hmm. So it's like it evens out, right? That they should be rewarded. They should get more because they're doing a better job than the other person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
agree with that. They
Yeah.
prefer it in cash, right, Joel? Like, you don't have to claim that on your taxes if they pay in cash.
Quote unquote.
The damn Nazis at the IRS.
It's a gray area, but yeah, you don't have to. Because if it's card, you have to enter that into the computer, and the computer knows that you have to put in a certain percentage to declare. So it basically automatically does that, or you have to enter it in, and it says no, you're wrong, or whatever. And with cash, obviously the computer does not know what you got tipped, so you can put in, oh, I got tipped $1, even though you got tipped $10. But at least where I worked, it had to be over a certain percent of cash that basically so it basically summed up all the cash that I sold to all the tables like within 2 weeks, and I had to hit a certain percent of that total of declared tips for the state of California. If I was under that, then I would be like, I don't know. I forget. I don't think I was ever under it, but I think they would literally take it out of like your paycheck, even further. So it was kind of like you have to stay. I think it was above 10% or something, which equals a lot of cash for sure.
Yeah.
Damn bastards.
It was the Nazis, right?
Thanks a lot, California.